you'll see me all around Facebook and social media. I'm also part of the Tales of Outlaw group and the Radiate Northwest group here. So if you have any questions or want to get a hold of me after the panel, those are some good ways to get a hold of me. So today we're going to be talking about Tales of Science. So we're going to be looking at some of the biological aspects that they include into the games. So a quick show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the Tales of series? Okay, no worries. I'll walk you through it as we go along. So one of the things that I really like about the Tales of series is they do a lot of research into making these games. And one of the things they do, especially with a few of the games that we're going to cover today, is they incorporate real-world physics and real-world science and biology into the gameplay and into the world creation. And that gives these worlds a really deep dynamic, and it allows us to really connect to these worlds, even if we're not able to really put our finger on why we're able to connect to them. So I'll be going through a couple of those. But how am I able to talk to you about this? So I do have my bachelor's in biology. Over the years, I've run several scientific projects, including a cross-departmental science project between Hopkins Marine Lab, and the CSU-MD at CSU Monterey Bay Robotics Lab back in 2011. Since then, I've given lots of public talks at elementary schools, conventions like this, as well as other various events. I do citizen science research, as you can see over here on the left, when I'm digging out geos, which is super fun. You get to play in the dirt all day. And then I'm currently a interpreter and naturalist at the Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium. So there are going to be some spoilers in the games, especially Tales of Graces, Tales of the Abyss, and Tales of Xillia 1 and 2. Another quick disclaimer, I get really excited about this stuff. So if I start talking too quickly or something doesn't make sense, this is a pretty casual panel, so don't hesitate to interrupt me or raise your hand, and I'll slow down, I'll re-explain something for you. So today we're going to be covering ecology, evolution, and genetics. Now you need to understand these three concepts to answer a big question in the Tales games. And what's the big deal with manalobes? So in Tales of Xillia 1 and 2, I'll give you a quick synopsis of some Xillia lore here. So Tales of Xillia. In Tales of Xillia 1, you start out on a world called Rize Maxia. And this world is very, very lush. You have all these trees and mountains and animals and plants. And the reason why it's lush is because you have spirits that draw on the mana created by the Rize Maxians in an organ in their brain called manalobes, which just creates this huge, fruitful world. Throughout the course of the game, you discover that there's actually a second world that used to be connected to Rize Maxia called Olympus. And the Lord of Spirits, Maxwell, created a schism to separate people that were able to generate mana in the manalobes versus people that apparently didn't have manalobes in Olympus. And what this did is Olympus ended up being a very, very dry, desolate world. Very few plants, just kind of scraggly plants, think Joshua trees from Southern California, and just ferocious monsters. So that's the gist of it. And I'll be going into more detail about manalobes and why they're important to the Xillia games when we get into evolution. So let's start with Tales of Ecology. So with Tales of Ecology, I'm going to be getting into a bit of the science part first before I connect it to the Tales games. So ecology is the study of relationships between organisms and their environment. Now, organisms include flora and fauna, that's plants and animals, as well as microorganisms such as bacteria. Ecology can go everywhere from an individual all the way up to a biosphere, which would be the entire planet. For the course of this talk, we're going to be primarily focusing on an ecosystem and a biome, so kind of medium to continent size. and this is where you change slides, computer. Thank you. So there are several different types of ecosystems. The type of ecosystem is determined by the types of plants and animals that live there. So some of the different types of ecosystems you'll find in North America are the grasslands of Vacaville, California, the temperate forest that's kind of up in the mountains of Goat Rocks, Washington. If you've never been, it's gorgeous. I highly recommend it. As well as more of your desolate desert area of Zion National Park in Utah. There's tons and tons of these different areas, but they're all characterized by the types of plants and animals that live there, and that determines how they evolve and develop. So let's get into some specialized ecosystems. So over here we have Mount St. Helens. Now Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, and when it erupted, it blew a third of the mountain off. It completely exploded it, and it wiped this very old forest from the face of the mountain. It brought it all the way down to zero. There was nothing left. However, 23 years later, you start to see more foresty areas. There's still a lot of desolate areas, as you can see here, but there's plants and animals and small flowers that have started to pop up. And those started to pop up within the year of 1980, right after this volcano exploded. Now, nothing new came in. There weren't new plants and animals that were transplanted in here. These were all seeds that lay dormant deep underneath the soil. When Mount St. Helens erupted and it destroyed the ecosystem that was there, it gave these plants, they're called colonial plants, the opportunity to sprout and make a brand new ecosystem. So what's big here is that this isn't something new, but this is a ecosystem that lay dormant for decades, for years and years and years, until the right conditions occurred. Let's get another example. So allow me to introduce Namibia, South Africa. Have any of you been to the desert before? Yeah? So if you haven't been to the desert, I'm sure you've seen pictures, or at least a Indiana Jones movie. But it's a very desolate area. However, if you go there right after it rains, it bursts into bloom with all these gorgeous flowers and plants. And these last for a very short period of time, usually only overnight. And then the high noon sun comes again. I feel like I'm in Overwatch now. And it burns away the plants. However, these plants don't just disappear. Instead, the seeds lay dormant deep underneath the sand until enough rain comes for them to burst into bloom again. This is called a dormant ecosystem. And this isn't just for plants. You also find this with animals as well. So this is the desert rain frog, which I think is adorable. So the desert rain frog can lay dormant. It hibernates deep under the soil where it's cool and moist for years and years and years. I mean, these guys have been known to lay dormant and hibernate for up to 10 years. If enough rain comes, especially during the rainy season, these guys will wake up, and then in the course of the night, before the sun comes the next day, they will mate, they'll feed, and then they'll dig a new hole so that they can lay their eggs later and fall back into hibernation until the rains come again. All right, are you all with me so far? Okay. So as a quick side note, we're going to talk, we also have closed environments, closed ecosystems. Closed ecosystems are something that are self-contained. They do not have any communication with outside ecosystems. So the organisms and plants that evolve there only evolve there. They can't really communicate or expand their genome or their gene pool with other outside areas. And what this creates are very unique animals that you'll never find anywhere else. So an example of that will be Japan, surrounded by water, so you're not really going to have a lot of migration back and forth outside of the islands. And another example is going to be the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne. So you have these big mountains that surround this small area, so you don't really have species migrating back and forth. So everything that's there stays there. There's nothing new coming in. Okay, let's connect this to the tailscape. There are two Tales games that have some excellent examples of closed environments. So over here, we have the Legacy. In Tales of Legendia, the entire game takes place on a giant ship that becomes a floating island. And one of the characters, Will, is a naturalist. And he mentions that there are animals and monsters there that you've never seen on the mainland. It's a closed environment because it's surrounded by water. Another example is something called the Cliff-Off from Tales of the Abyss. So with Tales of the Abyss, you essentially have two worlds mixed into one. You have the outer crust, which is kind of what you imagine when you think of a world. It has sun, it has rain, and it has a sky. But then underneath that, you have what's known as the Cliff-Off. And this is where you have, at the start of the game, you essentially have one city. But underneath this crust, there's this hidden area that everyone forgot existed. So these are two examples of a closed environment. They don't communicate back and forth. You don't have organisms from the outer crust coming down into the cliff-off, or monsters and creatures from the cliff-off coming up to the outer lands. Does that make sense? Awesome. Okay, let's pull all of what we talked about with ecology into a single Tales game. So in Tales of Graces, there's two different worlds. You start off with the main world, just called Xillia. And this is kind of what you imagine with a regular world, like the outer crust. You have all of your different cities, and it's a vibrant, bustling place. You have all these different types of plants and animals. We have 3 or 4 separate ecosystems and monsters that have evolved to match those ecosystems. But as you go through the course of the game, you find out there's actually a second world called Fodra. And the course of the game takes you to Fodra. And when you first arrive on Fodra, you find it to be a dry, desolate place, very desert-like. So there's only a few very angry monsters and a few spindly plants here and there. However, in this game, you have what's known as mana. It's a pretty common theme in the Tales games. It's kind of like a flow of life and energy. And in the game, you reintroduce mana into Fodra. Now keep in mind, Fodra is considered a closed environment. It didn't have any communication with Xillia. But upon reintroducing mana into the ecosystem, all of a sudden, all of these plants and animals burst into life. Now these plants and animals the party didn't bring these plants and animals up here. They were always there. They just needed the reintroduction of mana in order to thrive. Now Pascal, one of the characters in the game, said it pretty simply. It looks bad now, but a long time ago, it was teeming with life. This life never disappeared. It was always there, just waiting for the right conditions for it to burst into life. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Awesome. Now let's get into what most people get most excited about, and this is evolution. And this is where we're really going to start pulling in what I was talking about with mana lobes. So evolution is essentially a change over time. It's a change in a species, or it's a change in an environment over time. Now a great example of this is the London peppered moth. Have any of you heard of the London peppered moth before? You have? Awesome. So the London peppered moth is a very common species in, surprise, surprise, London. Now this species has two main types of coloration. They have a light color and they have a dark color. Now it used to be, before the Industrial Revolution, the white color was dominant over the dark color. So you were more likely to find a light colored moth as compared to a dark colored moth. And the reason for this was because the buildings were light colored, and so the dark moths stood out against the white buildings. However, after the Industrial Revolution, the buildings were covered with soot, and all of a sudden, you were more likely to find the dark-colored moth as compared to the light-colored moth, because the dark-colored moth blended better into its environment as compared to the light-colored moth. So the population evolved based on the conditions it was in. Yes?
So would that mean that in the country you'd find more of the London peppered moth, and in the big cities you'd find the dark London pepper moth more often?
Just depends on what the environment is, but if you're like in a small village or town, this is a great option that is a little bit farther set from the factories, you're more likely to find the light colored as compared to the dark colored. Thank you for that. Now what's really cool is this has been the case for many years. But now London is going through a kind of bit of a revival, and they're cleaning up a lot of their older buildings. And you're starting to see a revival of the light-colored moths in London as compared to the dark-colored moths. Okay, so part of evolution is a change over time in a species. Now this creates what is known as vestigial structures. These are structures that once served a purpose but no longer do. So I have over here the blind cavefish. So the blind cavefish's ancestors were able to see. They had eyes that worked. However, the blind cavefish made its way into the cave, and being able to see really did nothing because it was completely dark. So over time, it evolved and lost the ability to see. However, it still has eyeballs. They just don't work. It's just an organ that's there. Now, a quick show of hands. When you're outside of costume, I'm looking at you, how many of you have tails? Well, believe it or not, we all have tails. It's a vestigial structure. So we all have a coccyx, which is a tailbone, and if you talk to an anatomist, that is considered a tail. But we no longer have tails. This is a vestigial structure. It's something that we have that no longer serves a purpose. So how do we evolve? How do we get all these new traits and characteristics? And that is through mutations. Now I want a quick show of hands. How many of you are able to drink milk? You are not lactose intolerant. So all of you that are raising your hands are mutants. So the original human genome, in the original human genome, after a child reaches its toddler years, it turns off the ability to digest lactose, and essentially that individual becomes lactose intolerant. Now let's take a look at the medieval ages. Around that time, it was very beneficial to be able to digest milk. And there were a few individuals that had a mutation on their genome that allowed them to digest milk into adulthood. These individuals, because they were able to utilize the nutrients from milk, were more likely to survive and pass that trait on to their children and their children and so on and so forth. So if we were to take a census, most people that are lactose intolerant are of Eastern descent because their ancestors, it didn't matter if they were able to digest lactose or not. Most people that are able to drink milk are of Western descent because it was beneficial to their ancestors to be able to drink milk. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
To the Tales game. So in Tales of the Abyss, we get into cloning. So over here on the left, I have a character named Mary, and this is the original Mary. Later in the game, she is cloned. It's called a replica in the game. And this is our replica over here on the right. Now you'll notice the sprites are exactly the same. They have the same hair color, they have the same skin tone, they're even the same height. Now let's take a look at two other replicas. So this character right here is Ash, and he is the original. This character here on the I can do it right, left, right, is Luke, and he's the replica! I did that for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now let's take a look here. They do look very similar. They both have red hair. They both have green eyes. I mean, I know Ash kind of looks angry in this picture, but that's just personality traits. But take a look at their hair color. Ash has much darker hair than Luke does. Now, from a design perspective, I know that this is so you can more likely able to tell the two characters apart. But if you look at this from a geneticist's point of view, Ash and Luke should have the same hair color. If anything, Ash should have lighter hair than Luke. So Luke spent his entire life essentially locked in a manor, whereas Ash spent most of his adult life outside. And in that case, he should have lighter hair than Luke. However, he doesn't. So this tells us that when Luke was created during mitosis, there was a mutation that occurred on his genome which coded for a lighter color hair as compared to the original, ash. You with me so far? Awesome. Now let's talk about divergent evolution. So in divergent evolution, you have one main ancestor. Now this ancestor then spreads across to all these different ecosystems that we talked about. And then depending on what ecosystem they go in, there are certain traits that are going to be favorable as compared to other traits. Now fast forward generations and generations and generations. If you compare those descendants, they're going to be vastly different. This is called speciation. They change because they adapt to their environment. So if we look at the wolf ancestor, you have the wolves, which then diverged out into all of these different species. You have modern wolves, ancient Asiatics, and of course Rapide, who is a fantastic character from Tales of Vesperia. This is often found in closed environments, like we talked about earlier. So we have Darwin's finches from the Galapagos. These finches all went to different islands, and depending on where they were getting their food, determined what beak shape and beak size was most favorable. So when Darwin went to the Galapagos, he found all these finches that had different beak shapes and were different species, depending on what was most favorable in the island. It was originally one population, but then diverged out and created all 4 different species. Make sense so far? Okay. I really like squid. They're fascinating and they taste good. But I'm just going to talk about why they're fascinating. So we have squid here. Both of these squid live in the abyss. Tales of the abyss, that is. And they all come up and then at night, they come up to the surface in order to feed. However, to avoid competition so that there's food for all, they've evolved to feed in different areas. We have Doryteuthis opalescens, the California market squid, which is only about this big, and it comes to the shallows in order to feed. That way, it doesn't compete with Pacificus gigas, the Humboldt squid, which feeds out in the pelagic ocean. That's the open water. This guy can get 6 to 8 feet long, and it has an attitude to match. It is very angry at everything that breathes, and some things that don't breathe. So the idea here is you have 2 separate species that evolved to avoid competing with each other. So you have evolution based on food, but then you also have evolution based on predators. I'll admit I put this in just because it's super cool. So this is Vampiroteuthis, the vampire squid. This guy evolved to be able to turn itself inside out so that it doesn't look like a squid to predators. It's also only about this big and super cute. Okay, so we talked about speciation. We talked about what it means for a population to evolve. And we talked about how you can't create something from nothing. A new organ can't just burst into life. So let's equate this back to the Tales games. And let's talk about Tales of Xillia. So we talked about Xillia a little bit before, and Manalobes, for those of you that weren't familiar. So here's what we know. Olympias and Rhizamaxia, those are those 2 worlds I talked about, were once connected. They were the same population. 2,000 years prior to the events of the game, a schism was created to create 2 closed environments. We didn't have species, we didn't have anything going back and forth between Rhizamaxia and Olympias. We also know that channeling arts, that's the ability to create magic basically using their manalobes, is widespread on Rhizamaxia, but essentially extinct on Olympias. But there's a character named Alvin who is an Olympian that goes through the schism and ends up in Rhizamaxia. And he's able to use an item called a Lilium Orb. A Lilium Orb accesses the Manalobe and Rhizamaxians and allows them to learn new arts. And it also allows 2 people that are using the Lilium Orbs to connect together to create linked arts. It's like tag teaming. But Alvin doesn't have a mana lobe. How can he use a Lilium orb? Here's what we know. So over 2,000 years ago, Maxwell created the schism separating Olympias and Rize Maxia. So that created two close environments. But they were the same population. Sorry, slightly lost my train of thought there. When those populations separated, people with mana lobes went to Rize Maxia. Olympians still have mana lobes. So the Rize Maxians couldn't suddenly create mana lobes. It's not like the blind cavefish could suddenly disappear their eyes or suddenly reappear their eyes. So the Rize Maxians had mana lobes, which means that the original population also had to have mana lobes. But they're not able to use them. So the people that went to Rize Maxia, wow, I am really sorry. I completely lost what I was saying there. Let me start over. So you have the main population 2,000 years ago. This population all had the same organs, but the people that were able to use mana were brought into Rize Maxia, and those that were not stayed in Olympias. They all have the same anatomy, which means that the people in Olympias still have mana lobes. But these mana lobes aren't active. They're inactive mana lobes. So the Olympians, while they have mana lobes, aren't able to channel spirits, and they're not able to create arts. So that means there's two different types of mana lobes, active mana lobes and inactive mana lobes. Essentially, you can consider a mana lobe a vestigial structure, kind of like tails in humans and eyeballs in blind cavefish. However, since Alvin is able to use a Lilium orb, this tells us that there's a secondary reason for mana lobes to exist. It could be some sort of mana circulation or a kind of inert mana storing device. I don't know what that is. But this ability allows him to use Lilium orbs even if he isn't able to actively cast arts. Does that make sense? I know I kind of stuttered there. Okay. But let's take it one step farther, and let's talk about Jude. So Jude's a character in Tales of Xillia that has an Olympian father and a Rize Maxian mother. So he's a half-breed, he's mixed. So what do we know? We know that Jude has a strong mana lobe. He's a doctor. He uses his mana lobe in order to cast healing arts. And we also know that Derek, his father, is Olympian, and Ellen, his mother, is a Rize Maxian. Here are our assumptions. We can assume that Derek has an inactive mana lobe, being from Olympia, so he isn't able to cast arts. We also know that Ellen has an active mana lobe, as she's Rize Maxian, so she's able to cast arts. And we can both assume that both parents are homozygous. Now what I mean by that is that all traits, when you look at genetics, are usually coded by two alleles. One allele from mom and one allele from dad. You combine them together, and that's what codes for the trait for the kid. So what we can assume is with Derek Mathis, his mom and his dad both had inactive mana lobes. And we can assume that Ellen, being Rize Maxian, her mom and her dad both had active mana lobes. So when she was born, she has two alleles for active mana lobes. Now we're going to put this in what's called a Punnett square. So we're going to have Derek here on one side and Ellen on the front. And what this is going to tell us is what alleles Jude is going to have. So we do the math, and Jude is called heterozygous. That means he has one allele that codes for an active mana lobe and one allele that codes for an inactive mana lobe. But we know that he's able to cast arts. So that tells us that an active mana lobe is dominant over an inactive mana lobe. So if we have a Rize Maxian and Olympian that have a kid together, more likely than not, their kid will be able to use arts. They will be able to have that active mana lobe. Now let's take that one step farther. Let's pretend there's going to be a Tales of Xillia 3. What we will see is about 75% of the population We'll have active mantelopes because we can assume that these two populations will continue to intermingle with each other. And about 25% will have inactive mantelopes. And as time continues on, more and more of the population will have that active mantelope. Are there any questions? No questions? Well, if anything comes up, I'll be here today. Feel free to ask, and thanks so much for coming.
You could do the science of it, like, all right, 25% of the population can't use art. Well, psychologically, what does that do to the 25% of the population?
Dude, and there's so much you can look at the evolution of how the evolution of a culture affects the evolution of a species, the evolution of humans. I mean, you see that kind of.
It's in some of the other games, kind of. You see it with the half elves and Symphonia.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to do that when Xillia comes around.
I'm so down.
Okay.
Good
to know. So it's basically a whole Xillia panel.
It's Xillia and Graces. So I use Graces for ecology and Xillia for evolution and genetics, and that's to answer what's going on with. I'm cool. That's what that means. I just said that. There's mantelopes, ecology. So I talked about what ecology is, so the study of relationships between organisms and their environment, and that we're going to be focusing primarily on ecosystems and biomes. And then I talked about what different ecosystems are, so grasslands, temperate forests versus badlands.
Yeah.
Let me know if I'm going too quickly.
No, you're good.
And I talked about specialized ecosystems, so like destruction, how destruction can allot the opportunity for dormant species and dormant ecosystem to thrive and to jump into being. And then water is another specialized ecosystem, especially in the desert. You add water and all these dormant plants burst into life. One of my favorites, the desert rainbow. Adorable, these guys are so cool. Okay, so these guys hibernate deep in the sand where it's moist and cool. And they have to have just the right amount of water in order for them to come out of hibernation. So they can hibernate for years and years and years and years. And I think the record is 10 years or something like that.
Nice. Same.
But then, I know, right? Like me right after college. So right after a big rain, these frogs come out generally only for a night before the sun comes back out. They eat, they breed, they dig a hole, and then go back into hibernation, waking up shortly to lay their eggs and then to hibernate again until the rains come again. Super, super cool.
Don't they also make that noise? Yeah.
Then I talked about closed environments. So those are environments that are independent of themselves and don't interact with other environments. So other ecosystems, I should say. So everything that is there stays there. There's nothing new that's really introduced into them. So you have Japan as a great example, surrounded by water, as is the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne, which is surrounded by giant mountains on all sides. And then I talked about closed environments in the Legacy, as well as the Clip-Off.
Yeah. What a fun place.
I know, right? So cool. And then I connected all of this to Graces. So you have Affinia, where you have this lush environment, lots of different species of plants and animals, vibrant life. And then you go to Phodra, which is very, very desolate. So you just have angry monsters and a few spindly dead plants here and there. But once you reintroduce mana, you have all these plants that burst into life. Now the plants weren't brought there. It's not something new that was introduced in the environment. They were always there, dormant under the soil, like the desert rain frogs.
Yeah.
But once mana was reintroduced into the system, all this life burst into being. And Pascal said it herself. It looks bad now, but a long time ago, it was teeming with life. That life never disappeared. It was just waiting for the right conditions to come up again. Then going into evolution, which brings in Xillia and more of the mantelopes. So I talked about what evolution is. Are you familiar with the blood and peppered moth? And then vestigial structures, so the blind cavefish. The blind cavefish's ancestors had fully functional eyeballs. The blind cavefish migrated into the caves. Sight was no longer a necessary needed trait, and so it evolved out, but it still has eyeballs. They're just non-functional, like Manaloops. And then I do like to ask, how many of you have tails? It's kind of funny if there's furries in the room. Like my hat today. He raised his hand. If you ask any kid on the street, of course we don't have a tail. But we actually do in the form of a coccyx, which is a bone structure that no longer holds purpose, but we still have remnants of it. So the big idea here is that organs can become inactive, but evolution doesn't suddenly create new organs. Another great example of this are lungs. So if you go back a few million years, our ancestors had gills, and then they came up and evolved fully functional lungs. Now these lungs aren't a new organ that was created, it's an evolution adaptation on a previously created organ.
Right.
So you don't create new organs, you just adapt what's already there.
Yeah.
And then this one's one of my favorites. New characteristics are created through mutation, changes on the genome during mitosis and meiosis. And raise your hand, how many of you are able to drink milk? Well, all of you that are raising your hand are mutants. The original human genome coded for you to be unable to drink milk after reaching adolescence. And that protein that digests lactose turns off, lactate. However, in the Middle Ages, there was a mutation that allowed adults to be able to digest milk.
Yeah.
Now, during that time, nutrients were far in between. So individuals that were able to digest milk were favored upon. They didn't die.
Yeah.
And that trait was passed on to their kids and their kids. If you look at a census of people that are lactose intolerant and those that aren't, those people that are lactose intolerant are Eastern descent, and those who are not are usually Western descent because of cultural evolution.
Nice segue.
Thank you. I'm not sure when you guys came in.
We came in.
You came in right
here. Yep.
So first example was Barry. So you have a perfect clone, no mutation, and then you had Ash and Luke. So that's new. And then we talked about divergent evolution.
Yeah.
And then the rest of them.
No, you did a good job.
Yeah, I could have done better with this part here explaining what Manaloops were about, but Annie and you guys were the only ones that knew anything about the Tailscape, so I got so mixed up with trying to explain Tails terminology, I forgot what I was saying.
I think you did a good job, considering, like, I know, you know, familiar with Anna and all that stuff, but I've not played Xillia yet. Yeah, it's my song. Oh boy. But yeah, if you want to do like a segue, like you can obviously keep doing the independent ones because I like the panel. And did you get a lot more turnout at Xillia?
Nope.
No?
Nope. People were not interested in it. But it also got it was the first panel on Friday.
They did that to me. They did that to me once, yeah.
I had, I think, like 4 people, and one of them was Brooke.
Yeah. You really need, like, you need a little bit of momentum to kind of, like, get them to come. I think the first time, did they stick me on Friday? I think both times they stuck me on Friday. And the first time I got a pretty big turnout, and then the second time I didn't get as big of a turnout, but I got like an interactive thing going on. Yeah, I would do that.
Hey, I'd be down to do a joint one. Get a joint one, because the other science one that I was thinking about doing next year is getting into quantum physics and talking about string theory of fractal dimensions.
Okay. That'd be cool.
Right?
You got the Riza Maxia stuff, and then also the Symphonia with Tepio and Silveron. They're actually interacting there too.
Yep.
So
Crazy coming out with like string theory.
I love string theory.
Oh man, I like perspection and what that makes you feel about string theory. And I'm not gonna actually learn much about it. But,
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd be down to do a joint. It'd be fun.
I'd love if there were more information on the panels, especially at Xillia, so it's not like game panels.
Yeah.
And I think they know it and they like having all the game panels, which is fine. I mean, but if we can get good turnouts, then
It's how their culture has evolved.
it's how the culture has evolved. Well, they get good feedback on the game panels.
They do.
Which is probably why Belle got a lot of questions why Tilda is not there
Yeah.
this year. Oops. But this upcoming, actually, if I want to go to Xillia, I need to buy my ticket now. Well, it's like $50 or whatever. I need to, because I know if I wait any longer, I'll start talking myself out of it. I do it every year.
Yeah.
I try to talk myself out of it. And ironically, the year that I wasn't going to go, and I knew I wasn't going to go, which is this year, it came up, and it was the weekend of Xillia Con, and I'm like, why did I do this to myself? Because I wanted to go so bad. But
I hear you there.
I'm down for it.
That would be fun.
It would make
That would be
people learn.
super fun.
And I don't know if you've noticed, but I got a way to run panels. I got some tricks up my sleeve.
Hey, I'll take it.
Yeah. You have so many more slides than I do too.
I do pictures.
Yeah.
And I love pictures. But then again, I just recently brought more of my intellectual panels to conventions. I usually do run game panels. Most of these are adaptations that I did. My base with this type of panel is with elementary and middle school kids. I used to be a guest speaker, and I would pull in the nerdy stuff to explain speciation, evolution, whatever they needed me to do.
Yeah.
So I have lots of Pokemon panels, actually.
I'm personal opinion, and if I had known our radius of like who was here that actually knew Tales and who didn't, I was gonna put in a Marvel skit. I was gonna put in a thing.
Yeah, if I would have known, I would have adapted this one to less.
Yeah.
Super Tales 4. But that's okay.
What was that? This is Haley.